which is on the effect of changes to legal aid on the not-for-profit advice sector. Yvonne Fovargue.
Thank you, Mr. Caton, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like first to turn to the comments by the Secretary of State, who said this isn't an attack on women and children. This is an attack on fat cat lawyers. Well, perhaps you could tell that to the 1,000 people who use the services of Bolton CAB for specialist welfare benefit advice over the month of January alone. Or to somebody like Jeannie, who emailed last night, extremely pleased with the result in the Lords, and saying that perhaps now people like her can leave an extremely dangerous situation and receive the financial help and the support to do that before they're murdered. The changes to the legal aid system will have a destabilising effect on the funding of advice agencies, law centres and CABs. Hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions, lose out. There is a disproportionate effect of the funding cuts on the not-for-profit sector, which the government's own impact assessment agree. They receive 77% of the cuts to civil legal aid. And advice agency funding, as I've often said, is a bit like a game of Jenga. It's complicated, it's interdependent, and small amounts removed can lead to the whole structure coming crashing down, leaving the vulnerable clients underneath with nowhere else to go. It's not really worth looking at the new position under the legal aid bill without looking at the current position. And Citizens Advice Bureaus will say that they will receive £51.3 million less in 2012-13 than in 2010-11. Law centres have had a 52% cut in their local authority funding. Coupled with the devastating effect that the legal aid cut will have, Citizens Advice Bureaus will lose £28.4 million, law centres will lose £6 million, and over 85% of their current legal aid funding. Up to 18 law centres could be lost, and up to 50% of Citizens Advice Bureaus, that's over 200 bureaus with 1,500 outlets, could close completely. And 100% of law centres and CABs, that's 100%, say that they will operate on a vastly reduced service if these changes go through. In total, the not-for-profit agencies will lose £51 million. In my own borough of Wigan, there will be a cut of £428,000 for specialist work. The Citizens Advice Bureau loses £133,000. That's 3.5 caseworkers, plus their admin support, and the legal aid lawyers who provide the rest of the social welfare law will lose the remainder. These aren't fat cat lawyers. These are lawyers working with the most disadvantaged people in their community. I will give way.
With regards to the issue about non-for-profit advice services and centres, has the Honourable Lady seen a statement by the Minister for Civil Society dated the 22nd of November 2011, which says that the Government has committed £16.8 million towards non-for-profit advice centres and services?
I have seen that statement, and I will come on to the statements that have been by the Ministers, both the Secretary of State for Justice and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who yesterday made an announcement about advice funding. Citizens Advice Bureau will alone lose 500 specialists. And make no mistake, this is specialist work. It's not simple form filling that people can do by themselves. My own bureaus tell me that in the last 3 months, their appeals to the commissioners have increased by 50%. Surely people are not expected to do this by themselves. And I will tell you the story in this brief time of just one client that went to a CAB called Sharon. And she went when she was told that her income support claim would be stopped as she was living with her ex-husband Darren, and that he should be supporting her financially. Now, after a lengthy interview with an advisor, Sharon told the specialist caseworker that she wasn't living with Darren, but in fact that he used her address for financial purposes, as he often didn't have a permanent address for long periods. He also stayed on occasion to help care for her, as she had got severe and chronic mental health problems. The advisor challenged the Department of Work and Pensions decision using the lengthy and complex case law around the living together test, and the specialist caseworker provided a written submission to the tribunal contesting the DWP's interpretation of the case law and provided expert evidence to show that Sharon's relationship with Darren was a close friendship. And at the appeal, the tribunal judge commented on the substantial body of evidence provided by the specialist and used it to conclude that Darren's relationship with Sharon, and I quote, was more akin to an adult child who goes to care for a frail elderly relative who's living in their own home. Sharon had all her benefits reinstated. Where does the Minister expect people like Sharon to go in the future for her help?
Will my honourable friend give way? Can I congratulate her on securing this very important debate and support the argument she's making so eloquently? Isn't it a particularly cruel irony that these cuts happened at precisely the time when, because of benefit cuts and working tax credit loss, families are under especially acute pressure, and therefore there's a double harm from these very damaging cuts?
I totally agree with my honourable friend, and in fact the need for advice will increase when universal credit and the personal independent payment come through. All the evidence from the past proves that when there are changes to the benefit system, particularly in the 6 months before and the 6 months after, the need for advice increases. And there will not be the places to go to pick up this slack. Age concern, the pro bono unit, the free representation unit, all agencies that have been mentioned by the Minister and the Secretary of State as being able to pick up the slack have categorically said that this is not possible. There will be a loss of these specialist services. I will give way.
Susan Jones.
Friend, and also for securing this debate. I think it was made about fat cat lawyers, and to be honest, I think if it were fat cat lawyers, most of us would be absolutely delighted. But taking the example of Citizens' Advice in Wrexham, where 6 paid posts will go, an additional problem with that is what happens to the service which is provided maybe for a couple of hours a week, a couple of hours a fortnight in the surrounding villages. And does my honourable friend agree with me that those impact on villages like Roslanid, Rhegog and Chirk, if the services are cut, would be devastating for people in those villages, particularly those who are currently out of work or maybe on low incomes, because they would have to pay additionally for travel to the urban centre if they could get appointments?
I totally agree with my honourable friend. The effect on the people using the services who are disproportionately on low income will be devastating. And individuals either won't appeal, which will end up costing the state more, and they actually have been, remember, unlawfully denied benefit. They may take the case themselves and be unable to present the evidence effectively or provide the right sort of evidence, or they may end up at the MP's surgeries. And I think we'll all admit that we're not legal experts, and we will find there will be nowhere else to refer on to. And there is a report, which I will recommend to the Minister, produced by the Young Legal Aid lawyers, which demonstrates how much MPs do rely on their local advice centres. I do need to make a tiny bit of progress, but I will. This is just welfare benefits. Debt clients will lose access to early advice, which will give the perverse result that actually they may well be sent away and told, well, if you get into more debt and are at risk of losing your home, we might be able to see you. Employments, clients who are unlawfully dismissed will have nowhere to go and will end up claiming benefits. This loss of specialist provision has great implications for the future. Their experience will be lost, not just for this generation, but to future generations, as they are there training other advisors, quite often volunteers, and they'll be unable to pass on this experience because they won't be there within the agency. And I'd just like to remind the Minister of the cost of a case. A case like Sharon's, which had such benefits for her, was £148. That's how much a welfare benefits case costs. A debt case costs £180 and a housing case £160. What are the knock-on costs to the other agency of taking away this small amount of funding? Now, I know the Minister has many times said he disagrees with the King's College and the CAB figures of the savings that will be made to the state by keeping these matters in scope. But I would like to ask him what his estimate is. Has there any estimate been done from the government of the knock-on costs of removing specialist work from legal aid? But the real tragedy, as my honourable friend mentioned, could be the loss of whole agencies. Often the large agencies who've done the right thing, they've diversified their funding and they've contracted with the Legal Services Commission. I'll give the example of the Manchester Community Legal Advice Service. The services were jointly commissioned by the local authority and the Legal Services Commission in October 2010. There was a 3-year contract awarded to October 2013, with the possibility of 2 more years if the targets were hit, which I may add they have been. 1.2 million will be directly lost from this service from the legal aid funding, and it's likely to have the knock-on costs of another 800,000, leaving to over £2 million being lost from this service. 34 specialist advisors will be lost, and 97% of the specialist services across Manchester will go. Contracts have been signed for premises and other essentials, predicated on a 3-year contract, which was given to them. And this poses a real risk that a continuation of the whole CAB and Community Legal Advice Service in the City of Manchester. In effect, Manchester could become, in terms of face-to-face advice, a complete desert. And who will be affected by this in the city? Well, the majority of the clients, as my honourable friend said, they're on low income, they have a disability, they're black and minority ethnic, they've got higher than average rates of unemployment, debt, homelessness. These are the people the cuts will affect, not the fat cat lawyers. Could the Minister please comment on the future of the Community Legal Advice Services who signed contracts in good faith and are now finding that these contracts are being reneged on? And that's just one example. Now, when this is spoken about in the House, there are many fine words from all sides of the House, but actually, as one of my volunteers, a very feisty volunteer, said to the Mayor when he spoke about the CAB when there was a funding cut going, fine words, butter no parsnips, let's see the colour of your money. And that's really what we need to see. We talk about the transition fund, £20 million given for advice agencies. But transition to me means moving on. It's moving on somewhere. I can't see where advice agencies are going to move to get this specialist funding. I really feel that a lot of them will be transitioning into oblivion. I will give way.
I'll be back to her for giving way and congratulate her on securing this debate. I think that she's hitting upon one of the really key issues here. The continued existence of these advice agencies is obviously important, but ultimately, if their clients can't afford to access the services, then the fact that the organisation themselves exist is of very little value. Now, the legal aid funding that supported welfare claims and appeals was absolutely fundamental to many of those people continuing to access benefits that ultimately turns out they were entitled to. She's being very generous in assuming that the government are genuine in believing they want to find an alternative. But is it possible that the government actually quite like the idea that a lot of people won't be able to claim these benefits in the future? Not only does it save money on legal aid, but also saves in welfare. Is it possible that actually it's been entirely planned?
Yvonne Fovargue.
Were I a cynic, I might agree with my honourable friend, and I might look at the fact that the Minister for the Department of Work and Pensions only mentioned 3 weeks ago in this very chamber that the backlog of appeals was almost, I think, getting on for 9-10 months. That certainly won't happen if people don't have the access to the appeals anymore. I'd also like to welcome the announcement by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury that there will be more money for advice. But being a pragmatist and having worked for an advice agency, the bottom line is when, how much, and what for, basically. And without that, I can't welcome it too great. And as my honourable friend said, is it a coincidence that this funding is removed at the same time as the need for advice will increase? What assessment has been done on the need for specialist advice in the period of change? And finally, has the Minister, I know it's not his area, but has he discussed with his colleagues when the advice review is due to be published? I would have thought it's essential to publish the results of this advice review before the decisions are made on the removal of legal aid from advice agencies. So, in conclusion, I welcome the vote in the other place that people should have access to legal services that effectively meet their needs. CAB and other advice agencies have been offering these services for over 70 years, and they're just as vital now as they were then.
Advice services such as CAB have expressed concerns about the effect of the bill, and I quote, "What is left of legal aid will be unworkable for many advice providers." Is that the opinion of the Honourable Lady as well?
It is, because there is what's known as a critical mass in this area. I mean, don't forget, advice agencies have already taken an unplanned 10% cut in the rates of these cases this year. To remove it completely is to destabilise it, and it may not be worth employing an advisor. In fact, you cannot afford to employ an advisor for the small amount of work that's left in scope. I've always believed that a thriving advice sector contributes to a healthy society, with fairness and the access to justice for all at its heart. The changes to legal aid rip the heart out of the advice sector, and it'll leave the vulnerable lost and alone, knocking at the doors of local authorities who are cash-starved, at the doors of MPs' surgeries. They're not just heartless changes, but they're economically unsound.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Caton. And firstly, I'd like to start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Makerfield for securing this debate and for her contributions to a vigorous and informative debate on this important issue. And I understand and I share the strong concerns and the high level of interest expressed about the value of the not-for-profit advice sector throughout the debates on the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Bill in both houses. And I would like today to try to address the concerns made on behalf of Jeannie and Sharon and other vulnerable people to assure the Honourable Member that we have listened and that we are taking action. The Government does highly value the important role that the not-for-profit organisations such as CAB and law centres play in delivering advice services at a local level. The Government wants to support these organisations, particularly at this current time. The reforms to the legal aid system, as the Honourable Lady is well aware, will reduce the income of these organisations, and I and my colleagues across Government appreciate that this is a difficult time for free advice services. They are understandably concerned about their future. But given the current financial climate, any government today would have to take difficult decisions and make major changes to the services it funds. Current legal aid expenditure is approximately £2.2 billion per annum, which is 25% of the Ministry of Justice's budget. Legal aid must play its part in fulfilling the government's commitment to reducing the fiscal deficit and returning this country's economy to stability and growth. The legal aid reforms that we are proposing are therefore designed with the additional aim of achieving substantial savings. These changes are not ones that we take lightly, though the importance of seeing these changes in context cannot be overstated. Our structural deficit that we inherited from the mismanagement of the economy by the opposition presents a range of challenges to our economy and to our ethos on public service provision. I am, however, confident about and do stand by the criteria we have employed in determining what areas should attract funding under the bill. In the bill, we have sought to define clearly those areas that government believes should attract public funding in future under a reformed legal aid scheme. This will allow at least some certainty as to the areas which the legal aid market will continue to support and I hope thrive in future. We are aware and fully acknowledge that there will be implications for future provision. There is likely to be a need for fewer legal aid providers. The methods through which many services are delivered will change. Organisations may change, and advice provision will also change. And this is alongside other changes to the legal market, such as alternative business structures. And I can say to the Honourable Lady that the full impact assessment has been published, but she asked about the knock-on costs, and it is true that these are often difficult to define because they often depend on behavioural change. For instance, people switching from family courts to mediation. This will not mean the decline, though, of a thriving legal aid market in future, which can still be achieved if the market adapts. We have to acknowledge that there has to be an acceptance and recognition of the fact that this market will be different from the one we currently have. We must constructively consider how best people can be assisted and how sustainable voluntary organisations can be run under the new framework. The important issue here is whether services will be available for clients rather than whether that service is provided by any particular type of provider in a particular way. The expansion of telephone-based advice, which the Honourable Lady referred to, will create contracting opportunities. And we already have examples of providers, including those from the not-for-profit advice sector, who run face-to-face contracts alongside centralised telephone advice contracts as part of their business model. I will.
How would the Minister answer, therefore, Steve Hines from the Legal Action Group, who said if you want to create a system that removes access to advice, make it a telephone-based system?
Well, I have spoken to the gentleman on this particular issue, as I have with the Honourable Lady before. She made this point at committee. And the government is absolutely determined in its view that telephone advice are used appropriately and to the right clients can actually provide a very helpful service, not least for those, for instance, who are disabled or who live in remote rural areas and so forth.
Minister, and I appreciate what he's saying, but he'll know from his own surgeries that we have many constituents who come to us who say the last thing they want to do is to sit down, to have a telephone conversation. They want to see us face to face. So can you give us assurance that for those residents who do need assistance, who don't want to access it down a telephone line, a lot of older people in particular have problems with that they will be able to continue to get face-to-face advice?
Well, the telephone service is being only used in a limited number of areas so that we can see how it works. And yes, if someone is unsuitable, perhaps because of their age, for receiving telephone advice, there will be the alternative of them getting face-to-face advice. I am pleased to see that there are already good examples of not-for-profit organisations acting innovatively, forging partnerships with other organisations and adapting to the changing face of advice provision. I do accept that the proposed reforms are likely to be particularly challenging for the not-for-profit sector. However, as honourable members may be aware, legal aid is only one of many funding streams that Citizens Advice Bureau and law centres receive. For example, legal aid represents only 15% of the income of Citizens Advice Bureau. Could I also point out that our scope changes have not yet happened and will not do so for another year, giving us time to look at the changing needs of the market. Indeed, one of the major issues for this sector are the changes to other sources of funding, for example from local authority cuts, which is something that is determined by local priorities and not by central government.
And I'm encouraged by what he's suggesting about apparently having an open mind about listening to the concerns of the not-for-profit sector. Now, I recognise what he's saying about the need to reduce the overall legal aid bill, but he will be aware that Amendment 11, which is being proposed in the House of Lords, deals with a very specific area of social welfare law. And my concern would be that if he comes through with this policy without identifying any alternative, then those most vulnerable people who've been used to being on benefits and suddenly find that they've been told they're not eligible for will really be desperately marooned. Can he give us a sense as to who might pick up the slack in those cases? And if not, will he consider the government supporting that single amendment rather than scrapping the entire savings?
What I will actually do is give the honourable gentleman a very clear idea of what the government is proposing to do, in order that slack, as he called it, will not be forgotten about or missed. Because we are committed to ensuring that people will continue to have access to good, quality, free advice in their communities. And that is why the government acted and set up the £107 million Transition Fund to support the voluntary sector to manage the transition to a tighter funding environment. And that is why we also launched the £20 million Advice Services Fund and a government-wide review of free advice services. The Advice Services Fund has always been intended to provide support to the sector in the short term only, with the Cabinet Office review of the advice sector providing longer term solutions. The review is expected to conclude later this spring, I can advise the Honourable Lady, and will provide recommendations on proposals to secure the long term sustainability of the sector. And as the Honourable Lady said, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury announced only yesterday that the budget statement will set out that further additional funding will be made available to the not-for-profit advice services within the current spending review period to support the Cabinet Office review to make advice services sustainable over the long term. I give way.
Sarah Newton.
Thank you very much. It's just a very quick point. I very much welcome the Cabinet Office's work on changing the advice landscape. But could I get an assurance from the Minister that when those discussions are going on with national CAB, that they are really encouraged to make sure that they pass this new money down to the local CABs, which is really where most people really experience the very high quality work of the CAB?
Yes, the work that is that is being done through Cabinet Office is looking at local CABs, and I thank my honourable friend for making that point, and also highlighting the fact that actually national CAB is funded quite separately from local CABs. It's actually mainly funded by BIS, so bringing in a new player into the debate, and actually also highlighting the complexity of this whole debate. And I can tell my honourable friend that one of the problems we've had throughout the course of this bill and in the run-up to the bill was confusion, frankly, between people misunderstanding the nature of legal advice and general advice, the general advice that is the core of, for instance, CAB's provision, and that we are so keen to maintain. As regards existing contracts for law centres, clacks and clans, as raised by the Honourable Lady, I can say to her that we will honour those contracts and review how best to implement the bill when contracts need to be relet. And I can tell her that the needs of Manchester and the local area will be carefully reviewed as part of that review. I give way.
There is a lot of confusion between the generalist and the specialist help in the minds of the people who use it and in the minds of the people who provide it. It appears to be just in the minds of the government that this confusion appears to be made. In fact, I would say that the specialist help is needed for areas like welfare benefits, where the government has tried on many occasions to say it is simple form filling. It isn't. There are 8,690 pages alone of DWP guidance given to their decision makers.
Well, as the Honourable Lady knows, where there is an instance of someone's security or liberty, or where someone is in immediate risk of losing their home, we are not ending legal aid for civil advice. There seems to be some sort of misconception that we are taking away all legal aid for civil advice. That is simply not the case. What we are doing is prioritising our help towards those who are most vulnerable, given the overall funding that we have to work with. But I can confirm that my department is working closely with colleagues across government, particularly with the Cabinet Office, who are leading on this area to support this important cross-government work. The Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister are also aware of the ongoing work, which I hope will give honourable members assurance that government is listening to concerns that are being voiced for the not-for-profit sector and taking work forward urgently to address these concerns.
Order. Sitting is suspended until 1:30.